Welcome back. Today we're going to spend some time thinking about projects. There are certain things out there that we define more by what they're not than by what they are. A desert is a great example of that. What is a desert? Well, a desert is a place with very limited rainfall. That helps us understand that a desert is not a rainforest. The absence of the water defines the desert. So project work kind of falls into the same kind of category. If we understand certain kinds of work that are not innovative, then it helps us better understand what innovation is. So this session is actually more about things that are not innovative than innovation itself. So what exactly is a project? There's a lot of difference of opinion in projects, and some are very narrowly defined definitions. I find it more useful to take a more broader definition of project, one that fits more what people use in casual language. I think it's actually more useful than the narrowly defined project definition. The first aspect of a project that I think is pretty much agreed upon by everyone is the project's got to have a goal. You can't define success without some kind of goal. Now, there can be two different classes of goals that you can have in projects. One is a defined goal, and this is your kind of your classic project. I want to raise operational efficiency 5%, or I want to construct this factory, or build this road, or this house, etc. Very specific, concrete. When we're done, we're done. It's over. But there's also another kind of project. Some people would disagree that this is not a project, but I think that it really is a project, and that is an open-ended goal, such as we want to raise operational efficiency. If we raise it 2%, we want to raise it 2% more. We want to get 2% more efficient, and another percent efficient, and hey, another 5% efficient, etc. We can keep going endlessly. Now, what's critical is that if you have a project, everyone needs to agree whether it's a defined or open-ended project. If there's disagreement, and oftentimes that's not spoken disagreement, but just assumptional disagreement, then that creates problems down the road. So it's really critical to get everybody on board. And by stakeholders, I'm not just talking about management and upper levels, but down to the people who are doing the work, the techs, the operators. They need to understand, when is this project going to be done? And so it's not, for example, they may be thinking it's an open-ended project. You're thinking it's a defined project. You implement what you're supposed to implement, and then you leave. And then the operators are like, wait a minute, we're having problems here, and you're gone. Where are you? So you looked at it as success. They looked at it as a failure because they thought it was an open-ended project, and you thought it was defined. So it's really critical to get on the same page and come to understanding of a shared vision of success in a project. So the next aspect, which kind of obviously follows of having a goal, is you've got a plan to reach your goal. And of course, we infer that success happens when we complete the plan. So if the plan is tied to the goal, the plan has all the steps to lead to the goal, then success is completing the plan. So kind of a way to look at it is projects are goal plus plan equals project. Now, there's one thing I'm leaving out here that some people say is critical for a project, and I would disagree. I think that this is an optional step of a project, and that is scheduling and time. It can be included, but it's optional. Here's why it's optional. There are certain kinds of projects that you cannot be scheduled effectively, such as work on this in your spare time. We all have some of those. They might even be in our house. Clean that room that we don't really want to mess with. It's a plan. It has a goal, very definite goal, and there's a plan to it. So that's a project, but it's not necessarily tied into a specific time frame, and that's okay. When I get around to cleaning that room, it's still a nice thing to be done. So I just to be arbitrary and say that a project must have a specific calendar time or chronological time, no, It doesn't need to. You can accomplish a great deal with projects that are just fit in here or there. Another aspect is that what if there's elements in this project out of your control? And in 2020, there were a bunch of projects that were being worked on by millions of people across the country, and then COVID hit. Obviously, those project plans radically changed. Did that turn, because something happened and the schedule was blown up, did that mean that those were no longer projects? No, those were very real projects. But elements outside of anyone's control conspired against those projects and blew up those schedules, etc. So I think it's important to think about the time element with a project, but to arbitrarily define that a project must have a time element doesn't have to. So now if you have a project, obviously one of the things that quickly bubbles to the top in people's thought processes is how do we deal with the problems, the difficulties, how do we make a project follow through the plan so that we get success? Well, there's a number of difficulties. I mean, obviously this is not a complete list, but here's some major difficulties that a project can encounter. You have unknown factors, elements outside of your control, coordination of independent elements, like resources, people, subcontractors, etc., and changing scope. Now, I don't know if you're in the IT world, scope is a very familiar term to you, but it may not be as familiar to those outside. Basically, the definition of success, the goal, it changes as the project proceeds. And so you thought you were going to, success was achieving X, but then everyone changes their mind, or certain stakeholders change their mind as you go along, and you get these disagreements over what success means because you thought, hey, I implemented what you asked me to. They thought it meant a lot more, or they want it to mean a lot more, etc. So that can be a real gotcha in project work. So let's dig through each one of those in turn. Unknown factors. So if you have a project with unknown elements in it, and unknown means you don't know as a project manager these things. You can't plan, you can't write a complete plan because you don't know what goes in the plan, at least not all of it. So what you need to do is consult experts and experienced people who have already done this. Like if you were going to be building a building, you go to an experienced architect, or at least a trained architect who has gathered the knowledge of how to properly build a blueprint. And you have this proper blueprint, and then you execute the plan. And you probably would want to consult with your general contractor and perhaps with some of the subcontractors to make sure that your plan actually fits what's reasonable and can be expected. Key thing is you've got to cover every contingency. Don't just assume that the best is going to fly. You've got to go through all the details and map everything out. The unknown is the enemy of projects. You've got to resolve the unknown. I remember working on one particular mini project where they had about half a dozen of us go into a conference room, and they're like, develop this process. So we sat there and we spent like 2 days talking, and turned out about 2 people in the room had most of the answers, and I contributed a little bit, and the rest of us contributed tiny bits while these 2 people covered about 90% of what needed to be done. But collectively, within the half dozen of us in the room, we had a plan that covered 100% of what we needed. So we hammered through all those pieces and put everything together. When we were done, we had a process, and we use that process today. It was a very, very productive experience because we had all the experts and experienced people in a room, and we could put out a result that was 100% complete. So the next piece, elements outside your control. Obviously, that defeats many, many projects. All you really have is contracts, agreements, commitments, and let me add to that communication. You really need to talk and communicate with other people who are involved so you understand what's going on in their world, understand the constraints they're under in order to get a feeling for how that's going to impact your particular project. So a contract is no good if the person you're doing the contract with simply can't deliver. So communication is a key element that I should have added here and I didn't. Another thing is buffer time. There's been some rather humorous episodes on in online media, joking about buffer time. But you got to have buffer time in your project plans. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Contingency time, whatever you want to call it, contingency budget. There's a buffer, because the best you can do to handle the unknown, to work on the elements outside your control, there's still things that happen. And some of those things, like COVID, they just come up, blow up in your face, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no buffer time in the world that'll cover that. It's just, it is what it is. So you do your best and hope for the best. All right, so let's work on our next piece, is the coordination of independent elements. That is, so you've got a project and you've got various different subcontractors. My parents are getting a place built for them, and they had, folks doing framing, they had people doing plumbing, they had people, coming up and doing this, that, and the other task, and they had to coordinate all those independent elements. Of course, this gets very big if you're putting together something as large as a factory or a road or some large infrastructure project. And there's tools that help you coordinate independent elements, such as the Gantt chart, which I misspelled there. You've all seen this. It's kind of a common thing where this person's going to work on this during this period of time, and they'll work on this during this period of time, and so on and so on. This other person's going to work on this or other group, etc. And you plan all this kind of stuff out. Very detailed, very tedious, but it's very important so that people show up in the right sequence and the work gets completed. You don't have electricians showing up before the framing is done, etc. So the second thing in dealing with independent elements is communication, communication, communication. And I would encourage folks to intentionally set up communication processes. Maybe a regular meeting that you have with all the different people contributing in the project. Or perhaps if you're in an internal environment, even better than a meeting is some sort of an online chat group. So whenever something comes up, the people can freely hop in and say, hey, we ran into this problem, we ran into that problem. Recently worked on a project where we had an internal chat, and we have operators, techs, warehouse techs, who are going, hey, I have this problem, and they message, and then boom, the person who needs to deal with it responds, and you get this communication back and forth, and you get problems resolved very, very quickly. That's really helpful when you have different groups, different silos working together to set up kind of communications mechanisms to allow people to communicate. So all that communication doesn't just flow through the management. It's much faster if you get group-to-group communication. And ideally where the project management can see what's going on, but doesn't have to be the conduit of that communication, because that can be a real bottleneck. All right, changing scope. You obviously need a cleared, shared understanding of, is this a defined or open-ended project? And if the scope changes while you were working on the project, and sometimes to find projects, the scope has to change. You have to have a number of very unpleasant, sometimes, conversations with everyone involved, going, here's what our goal was, here's why it has to change, and this may require a purchase of a lot of pizza and a lot of thank yous and apologies, and whatever it takes to help people move their understanding from an old goal to a new goal, and again create a shared vision. The key is you must have a shared vision of the goals across everyone. This can be a little easier with an open-ended project because you're intentionally changing scope. The scope is going to change as you go, and so therefore everyone's still on the same page. When it's a defined scope, changing scope can be harder. But there are times it just has to happen. And if you're working on a particular project and you discover that the goal that you're working towards is just simply not going to be sufficient, but if you change, it's going to have great value, then yeah, you got to do it. There are times. Now you have to think about it. Just because someone suggests a change of scope doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it. There's times when you should or shouldn't. It needs to be well thought through. So if you are working with more of an open-ended kind of project methodology, there are processes, formal processes for dealing with projects that have open-ended goals. Now, you can use these processes like Agile and Scrum with defined goals. There's nothing that says you can't. But unlike some processes, the Agile and Scrum are also compatible with the open-ended goal. Typically, you have some sort of a cadence where you go through a period of time, oftentimes it's 2 weeks, and every 2 weeks you kind of reevaluate where you are, where you're going, what you should be working on next. And so if the scope changes, you can kind of shift with the scope. So these particular processes are very helpful in that kind of environment. So, in summary, a project is a goal plus a plan. Quite simple. So what is a project good for? What is a goal plus a plan good for? What can we accomplish with this structure? Well, we can build houses, we can build roads, churches, factories, schools. It's a goal plus a plan, right? The goal, I'm going to build this church. Plan, here's my blueprint. I want to construct this thing. You can start a new branch office or a franchise store. I recently heard that a burger chain is going to be moving into Nashville, Tennessee that's been out west, and people are really excited about it. Well, to do it, they need to set up a distribution center in Nashville. Well, they have distribution centers elsewhere, so they're going to go and take that knowledge. They know how to set up a distribution center. And they'll buy the land and build one, set one up in Nashville, and then set up their franchise stores in a cluster around Nashville. I don't think going all the way to Chattanooga, unfortunately, but that's a very rich in projects. You have goal, plan. It works really well. Filling your talk about order. I mean, most of you don't think of that as a project, right? But there is a goal. You got this list of items that need to be made, and there's a plan. It's presented there on the screen, and also some of it is not written down. It doesn't have to be a written plan, right? But there is a process that the employee of Taco Bell is taught on how to make the particular items. And so they follow that plan to make your bean burrito or your taco or whatever you're ordering. And then they deliver that plan, hopefully without any errors or mistakes, and you get to eat some great food. So even though it's very small, it's still a project. It's still goal and plan. Building a car is kind of a more obvious one. Hauling goods to a destination. So you don't have to construct something. It could be a kind of a process-related thing. So those are also projects. They have goals and plans. They fit. Cleaning your house, again, goal, plan, that kind of combination fits. So when you really think about it, almost all work is a project by this definition of goal plus plan. And note, I have this little word almost, because you could say all work, but no. There's actually a little bit that's not. A little bit. It's a tiny sliver. Tiny. Now, I'm not talking about mismanaged projects with ill-defined goals and terrible or missing plans, right? No, those are projects. They're just mismanaged. We've all done that. Hey, we've all done it. We've all engaged in projects where we haven't planned out our goals, or we haven't made good plans, or whatever. This is not putting anyone down. But those are still projects, and we're not talking about those. What I'm talking about is the kind of work where that work simply doesn't have goals. Or maybe that work doesn't have plans. Or maybe that work doesn't have plans or goals. And in fact, by not having goals, not having plans, or not having both, that particular kind of work is actually performed the most efficiently without goals or plans. And you're like, what? What in the world? And I said, it's very small. These are very limited. This is not, many people could go their whole lives without ever engaging in any one of these kinds of work. This is not normal. This is unusual. But that kind of work actually exists. And we will dig into that more in later episodes. So, to summary, is there work like that? Yes. Yes. Yes, there is. So, we've reached the end of this presentation. Please, if you haven't done this already, hit subscribe, upvote, and I'd really look forward to your comments. Thank you.